2020 was an unusual year to say the least. The ongoing pandemic crisis has meant that a lot of the films that were scheduled to be released this year have been postponed, and as a result there has been a distinct lack of large-scale blockbuster films which normally dominate the box office. However, there has by no means been a shortage of new releases. Streaming services like Netflix and the newly launched Disney Plus have thrived under these circumstances, and there have been a wide variety of films released directly to streaming without any theatrical release. So, although I've seen fewer new releases this year than I normally do, I still feel there is enough for me to talk about in this video. Unlike other online reviewers, I'm not going to do a ranked list, and instead just discuss a handful of the films I personally enjoyed this year in no particular order. Please note that I'm going off the UK release dates, so there are some films in this list which other reviewers might have included in their 2019 lists, just because these films didn't get released until 2020 in the UK. Without any further ado, let's begin. The first film I want to mention is one which I've already reviewed on the channel, and that's Christopher Nolan's Tenet. I really enjoyed this movie, in spite of its shortcomings. It suffers from overly emphasised exposition and a first act that's incredibly difficult to follow, but the action sequences and Nolan's sense of spectacle make up for that in spades in my opinion. Since my review, I was able to watch it again at the BFI IMAX in London, and that was genuinely one of my favourite experiences in the cinema. Overall, a very cool movie with a great cast and some fantastically crafted action sequences informed by a really unique concept. The next film I have on my list is Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire. This was an absolutely gorgeous film. I loved its tone and texture, the visuals were incredibly striking, but I was really keenly aware of the sound design, which was fantastic. The film took its time, and the relationship between the two leads felt very authentic and honest. It's a slow burn, but Sciamma's methodical approach to building the dynamic between the characters was almost hypnotic. The fact that there were so few extraneous characters and virtually no subplots meant that I was totally drawn into this story. Armando Iannucci's The Personal History of David Copperfield is a really interesting experiment of a film. For the first half, it feels somewhat erratic and all over the place, which is of course entirely by design, as the events fold in on themselves in the second half. I have no familiarity with the source material, so I don't know how faithful the film is to Charles Dickens's book, but Iannucci's flair for comedy is plastered all over it, albeit in a somewhat reined-in manner compared to his more overtly comedic work like In the Loop and The Death of Stalin. But as the pieces slotted into place and the story started to make sense to me, I found it strangely resonant. It's a film with a lot of heart, and it left me feeling warm. I would definitely recommend you give this one a chance and stick with it. Perhaps an underdog choice, but Guy Ritchie's The Gentleman was my favourite of the year for the first half of 2020. If you're a fan of Ritchie's other films, especially his earlier work, The Gentleman was an absolute treat. I love the snappy style of editing, the quick-witted dialogue, the characters and the world of this film. It was really funny. It's been a while since I've smiled along with a film like this. I really enjoyed some of Ritchie's slightly more mainstream blockbuster efforts like the Sherlock Holmes films and King Arthur Legend of the Sword, but this felt like a natural successor to his earlier films like Snatch and Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. I'm certainly excited for whatever he does next. Before I talk about my favourite film of the year, there's a few others I want to briefly gloss over. There's not a lot to say about Parasite that hasn't already been said, but it was really enjoyable, stylish, and managed to convey a really nuanced message which left me thinking about it for days after seeing it. The latest Pixar effort, Soul, is perhaps the studio's best since Inside Out. Pete Docter's film is full of heart, was gorgeously animated, but to me just lacked a little bit of something that would have made it one of the greats. Definitely recommended, but the ending didn't fully land for me and I can't quite explain why. Finally, The Vast of Night, which was a really gripping, unique film. I can't think of anything quite like it. It plays out like an audio drama at times with very little to motivate visual interest, a facet which occasionally works to the film's detriment, but the snappy dialogue and the excellent delivery from the relatively unknown actors keeps you totally engaged. So those are some of the films that really stood out to me this year, and if you haven't seen some of them, I'd strongly recommend them all. However, there was one film that stood out above the others for me, and that was The Assistant. I love the matter-of-fact way in which this film depicts the monotony of office life. It deconstructs the glitz of the film industry in a way that I think is accessible to everyone. But critically, it illuminates the issues with the system and the way in which it deals with sexual misconduct, and it does so in an unglamorous, almost anti-Hollywood way. The events are played out in the film via an almost scarily accurate realism, which is just engrossing to watch. Almost nothing is done for dramatic effect. The camera work and the actors work incredibly subtly, but I think that works in conveying the film's message beautifully. It certainly makes sense that the director, Kitty Green, is from a documentary background, but despite all this, the film never feels drawn out or boring. It's incredibly efficient in its delivery, and I think it managed to shed some light on a really important topical issue and presented it from an angle inside the industry which I think possibly hasn't really been covered before. And that concludes my discussion on my favourite films of 2020. For posterity's sake, here is my full ranked list for the year, which includes a few films which I haven't discussed but I still really enjoyed. I haven't been able to see every film I wanted to, so for the record, here is the full list of films that I have seen. My ranked list might change depending on a couple of films I'm yet to see, like Queen and Slim, and of course some of the later 2020 international releases, like Sound of Metal and Minari, won't release in the UK until later in 2021, so I won't consider those until the end of this year. Thank you for watching. I'd love to hear what your favourite films of 2020 were. If you have any recommendations, I'm always open to watching new movies. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more. But until next time, thanks.